Now, Pam. It's all yours, Pam.
Well, we didn't lose anybody with that, so that's wonderful. I have to start out by saying that I've read the book once. I'm not an expert on it, but I was really thrilled with it. And I too was a little bit hesitant about, I guess, maybe the title. But I couldn't believe how much information I was receiving as I read it. I'd also like to say that I have one of the digital copies, and perhaps some of you do also. So if we're going to be making specific references to places in the book, we should probably mention the chapter and then maybe say if it's toward the beginning of the chapter, because all our page numbers will be different. Mine are really on large print, so I have a lot of pages, and I'm sure they won't match yours. Okay, the hidden life of trees, how they feel, how they communicate. And I wanted to provide a little bit of background about the author, Peter Wohlleben. He is about 60 years old, so he has a lot of experience behind him. He's German. He studied at Rhein Gymnasium Sinzig and University of Applied Forest Sciences. So he is an actual scientist. His occupation for a long time was forestry management. And as you know, that usually indicates that we're going to be raising trees to our best ability so that we can get the best dollar out of them. Somewhere along the line, he made quite a switch, maybe 180 degrees. And so now he is working to protect forests. And he does this in Hummel, Germany. He's kind of in charge of tours and discussions and classes that are held at one of the big, it's like an ancient forest that has been set aside to just be a place like Natural Land Institute runs, where people can go, they can learn, they can enjoy things maybe they don't see other places. So his main message, not just this book, but the other ones that he has written too, his message is that forests matter on a more fundamental level than most of us even realize. And I have to say, it was surprise after surprise after surprise after I was reading the book. He wants to share some of his pretty shocking discoveries. And he makes a point in the introduction about saying that he feels they're pretty universal. And yet where we live, we might find some different sorts of things happening than where he lives. And I have one example of that later. Perhaps you ran across them too while you were reading. So the main conflict in the book is forestry versus conservation. Right off the bat, when you start reading the book, you're thinking about how it's written. And it is different. He uses a lot of personification, which is a literary device, and it uses non-literal language to convey concepts in a relatable way. And I'm interested in hearing from you if this was a little bit awkward for you, a little bit uncomfortable, or if you think he's actually trying to do something else other than use the figurative language. He talks about, the plants thinking and breathing and talking, all of that. Do you think the trees actually do that? Mark?
I'll I'll unmute myself here. I have a background in botany. I taught science for a number of years, and I actually worked with some foresters, and I will be happy to share this book with them. I think it'll be interesting to see their feedback. I initially had a real hard time with the concept that trees are thinking and they have a brain. He talked about brains and the little roots, ends of roots and things like that. And I had a hard time with that, but I think and he's very well researched. He gave a lot of credit to a lot of different scientific papers and things. And I think from my perspective, what helped was the messages that trees are sending. I'm getting some feedback. So the messages that trees are sending are chemical messages to each other, either through the air or through the roots. And I had to live with that as I read the book, because I don't think they think like we think, but it's more of a chemical response, and they share that chemical response with other plants, trees in this case.
The science community likes to talk about survival of the fittest, and it seems that a lot of the biological systems that are in place work toward that. So, can a tree really smell? Can a tree adjust itself to certain environmental characteristics to its own benefit? He definitely thinks so. And I have to say that I think a lot of what I read goes back to laws of physics, and maybe they're more automatic than actually turned off and on by the tree system. But I thought it was very interesting. This past week, my husband and I watched National Geographic Nova. They had a special about slime mold. And slime mold is a one-celled organism. But scientists have done a lot of different kinds of experiments around the world, and they have discovered that slime molds are capable of several higher level thinking abilities. For instance, their growth is strategic. Sensing and seeking nutrition is something that they do, and they know how to avoid things that would be not beneficial to them. They also have demonstrated the use of memory. There's no brain. So are they human-like or not? I don't know. But this program was especially interesting because the scientists' experiments included taking a petri dish and setting it down on the top of a table that had a map of Tokyo. And they put a sample of the slime mold right in the middle of the petri dish, and they put an oat on each of the outlying cities. So they could see that through the petri dish. They set it up like that. And then they watched and they did time-lapse photography. What they found was that the slime mold would start growing out in all directions. And then if a certain part of it didn't run into any nutrition, it would start to kind of degenerate and disappear. But the ones that actually reached the oat would increase in growth. And as that was happening and other parts were being depleted, there was kind of an economic pattern set up so that the organism was able to achieve the best amount of nutrition. And after viewing this for, I don't know, several days or weeks, they noticed that the pattern actually mimicked our transportation systems out of Tokyo. And so, maybe we should have had our structural engineers begin with that first, watching what the slime mold does. Okay, we have a couple of images to show you tonight. And if we could start with image number 1 on the screen share, that would be great. This was something that I picked up off of Twitter, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Not only the image itself, but the background of the person that posted it. She is in Scotland, and she is a dendrochronologist. So her job is to look at the rings in the tree and to find all the way back to the first year that they were born. She takes into account the climate and the atmospheric conditions during different periods in history that affected the ring growth. And she specifically works in looking at old timber in historic buildings and archaeological sites. So she does not work in a forest. And I thought that was a very interesting application of her scientific abilities. So I'm interested to hear what were some of the surprises that you ran across when you were reading this? And Kim, we can get back to the galley view or the gallery view. Anything that really jumped out at you while you were reading it and made you feel like, whoa.
Hi, this is Carrie. I think one of the things that really struck me throughout the whole book was how he's kind of tapping into some of the indigenous knowledge about the natural world, about plants and trees. When he talks about trees having feelings and having a sort of intelligence. And I know that, for example, in books that I've been reading lately about indigenous knowledge, and for example, if you've read Braiding Sweetgrass or any of those books, where when Native people go out to collect plants, for example, they always ask the plant first, and they get a response. They get a yes or a no. And they have these traditions about not taking the first one and only taking half or less than half. But each group of plantings they ask. And indigenous people in Africa, I know a plant biologist went down there to this story about he was trying to learn about the different medicinal properties of plants. And there were several different varieties of plant that this biologist said looked absolutely identical to him, but only one of them had the necessary quality for the medicinal chemical. And he asked the indigenous leader who was taking him around, well, how do you know which plant it is? And he said, oh, the plant told me. And I've had other conversations with other people about this communication with plants. So I found that very intriguing that a forestry scientist, Western guy, would be tapping into some of this indigenous knowledge about plant communication. And he's looking at it from a very scientific point of view, rather than from a spiritual or esoteric point of view. So it just seemed to me to be that our science is starting to open up to those possibilities. So that was, I think, the biggest thing that stood out for me in this whole reading of this book.
Jim? Jim, you're muted.
People have been trying to mute me for years. And what's striking to me is one of the worst things we ever did in our culture and in the West and in the modern human even was to drop the whole reality that other life forms don't have soul. And we did that centuries ago so that the medical profession could use animals for research because they didn't have a soul. Well, if the animals don't have a soul, good luck, Mr. Tree. And so I was a scientist, and I've been converted to the ancestor view. And once you are open to the soul and everything, then you're not just the human in a museum looking at exhibits, but you engage. When I do retreats, I send people off into the woods for a day, and after a while, you get really bored because you feel like you're the only one there. And when you start having a sense of presence with these others, then you feel like maybe you could belong. You're not in a foreign place, that there's others that have consciousness. And when I'm too cheap to buy the book, so I looked at the first 5 chapters on Amazon, and what struck me is, oh, this is all like Carrie's saying. This is just all indigenous stuff, and that's in all of us. That's our ancestors, and we cut ourselves off from that and made ourselves really foreigners in the land.
Jim, Mark said that botany is his background, and you said you come from a science background also. What are you from?
I was a nuclear chemist.
Wow.
And I'm not, obviously, so that didn't work out.
Oh, very interesting. I don't know if anybody's read anything about the ancient mariners that navigated without any kind of modern instruments. But that too is a fascinating look at nature and what it can tell us. And I'm not sure that it's an instance of the sea talking to the navigator and vice versa, although that probably does happen. But maybe it's mostly due to an increased awareness of a lot of natural elements that many of us are never exposed to. There's also a long, long history of that kind of thing being passed down through the culture. And only certain people are qualified to receive that information and send a ship, from one island to another. So I guess, just keeping our minds open to possibilities is really important. And one of the things that struck me while I was reading it was how well these things can do without us. We don't have to be there and be in charge of every step of the way. So that's kind of neat. Was there anything else that anyone was really surprised by while reading the book?
One thing that you just mentioned caused a memory to occur in my feeble brain. And when he talked about getting a forest back to what it was, you can't expect it to be done in 10 years or 20 years. It's going to take 250 or 500 years to go and let it, undergo succession or, go back to what its natural state was. So unfortunately, humans are not a very patient people, at least some humans. So I don't know if we would have the patience for that, but.
Well, we do have the patience for it because Natural Land Institute is doing that. They're restoring a lot of things to what we think is the original type of environment. And maybe it's not, maybe, you know, trillions of years ago, whatever. But that always interests me is how do our specialists know how to direct that, and where we're headed. And I've seen a couple instances, maybe Kim or Carrie can comment about things that have been started, but nature kind of took the upper hand again. And I'm thinking of water diversion in particular.
Are you asking me specifically?
Well, anybody from Natural Land Institute who is a little bit familiar with that, especially at Nygren is the one that I'm familiar with, where water was routed a certain way. And after a while, that tended not to be effective anymore. And so other efforts had to be made.
So I'm not exactly sure exactly what you're referring to, Pam, but the farmers channelized the Raccoon Creek there
Mhm.
and took out the meanders and took out the natural flow. And when we went and did studies before we did the restoration of the channel, there was only one species of fish there. And I know that just a few years, 5 or 6 years after we had re-meandered the channel, there were maybe 20, 25 species of fish there. I don't know the exact number.
And those had been introduced naturally, not by Natural Land Institute. Is that what
No,
you're
they just appeared. We didn't do
Okay,
anything.
that's pretty
for that.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So the other thing though about restorations, the difference between restorations and ancient prairies, for example, the Belbo Prairie, is that we can put in some plant species and we can maybe do a little soil inoculation to get some of the fungal mycorrhiza in there. But we can't recreate all the below ground community that's there. That took 8,000 years to create in that ancient prairie. So when we do a restoration, what a restoration is an attempt to give the land a kind of heads up so that it can start to do that process. And that process may take 1,000 years or 100 years, I don't know, but it's not, when you do a restoration, eventually, after a long, long time, there will be a memory. So the restoration we've been doing at Burr Oak Valley is different, for example, than a recreation, which is what we did out at the Nygren. So a restoration is where you have remnants left. So we had some of the old prairie left, some of the old woodlands and the gravel dolomite prairie were still there, but they had been taken over by invasive species. So in a restoration, we work to get the invasive species out of there. So that's closer to an ancient much closer to an ancient ecosystem. When we do a recreation of something, that's not close at all. So we've done a recreation of the prairie out at the front at Burr Oak Valley, and we did a recreation of prairies at the Nygren. So those will be hundreds of years before they're really close to what they could have been.
I think it's really rewarding though, what you've already seen and what you mentioned about the fish. You know, that's just almost miraculous. And how many of us are seeing eagles flying everywhere again, you know? Okay, Kim, can you put up or share image number 2? part of the title of our book is about the emotions that the trees have. And to me, this looks like maybe two cedars got started next to each other. And as the author spoke in the book, there's less competition going on than we would think, and more mutual support of trees that are near each other. And in fact, how the seeds are distributed and things like that, a lot of them tend to end up fairly close to the original trees. But here is an example. My sister, Marty Farwell, is a professional photographer, and she had me slam on the brakes as we were tooling around Door County, Wisconsin one day. She jumped out of the car and she snapped this emotional image of a cedar tree that had been trimmed for the benefit of power lines.
Mm.
I drove right by it, never even saw it, but it's just so amazing that when they cut the branch, this is what was left as a message to all of us. I think we're done with that one. Thank you. Okay, and then I'd like to open up and turn the discussion over to you. Anything that you want to bring our attention to, we're ready to look at it.
Yeah, I have something that brought, I'm Ken, and this is my wife, Mary. And I never thought about it as much, but when we go out hiking, we have a lot of cottonwood trees, and we'll see, the cottonwood trees growing in clumps, and some of them are quite large, and some of them are smaller, and they tend to, trees, you'll see clumpings of trees that do really, really well when they're near each other. And he mentioned, I think, and then some trees don't like being near each other, and they like to be separate, and like the apple tree, I think, was referenced. And how it's unique or interesting how the seeds of the trees that like to be separated are inside the fruit, and to where they have to be drug off or carried away before they are planted, as opposed to seeds of trees that like to be by each other, and how when they are by each other, grandpa takes care of the younger ones, and if they get in trouble, they can feed each other through their root systems. And I found that fascinating, and I started noticing it more when we're hiking, about how certain types of trees like being, and they do better when they're around each other.
I'd like to hear more about the love life of trees.
See anything there?
Which chapter was that?
Yeah.
What chapter was
Jim?
that?
Pam, Jim, or Dr. Michael Reese raised his hand.
Rice, actually.
What is it?
Rice?
Michael Rice.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, that's cool. Call me anything but late for dinner.
All right.
What occurs to me in terms of expanding awareness of what might be going on, there's a book out there, and I don't remember all the details. It was probably 30 years ago that I read it. It's called The Secret Life of Plants by a fellow who was in the electronic world, and he did, what do they call it? Where they hook people up to electrodes, lie detector tests. And one of the things they measure is galvanic skin response, moisture in the skin. So he decided to hook a plant's leaf, a plant that was dry. And he wondered how long it would take. We figured with this scientific mind, he'd be measuring moisture. He wondered how long it would take for the moisture to get to the leaf and register as he hooked his lie detector up to it. And instead of that, what he got was what he recognized from working with thousands of people as lie detector was from the plant. When the water was poured on the plant, he instantly got what he equated to a human sigh of relief
Mm.
at having been given water. So, you know, and that book, as I say, it's been many years. I'll probably go back and read it again now, but it I think really opens a space to expand the discussion that that we're doing here. And one of the things you had said earlier, Carrie, or others had spoken about how long it might take. One of the things we're doing here in Virginia, we've got some small piece of land that's on a clay base. I assume when the house was built 60 or 70 years ago, they just hauled clay in or took the topsoil off. So there's not much there. But what we've been doing is going to some of the natural forest and taking a woman's nylon knee stocking, filling it with rice, tying a knot at the top of it, and then planting it in the natural forest, in the old forest that we want to replicate, to try and get some of those organisms. And those organisms will gather around that white rice. You can't do it very well, from what I understand, with brown rice, but those organisms will just go and devour the starch in the white rice, go back anywhere from a week to a month later, and you've got now a whole, you know, a 2-pound inoculant from what it is you're trying to reproduce. If you can find, you know, the actual ancient environment that you want to bring to the one that's been destroyed, maybe we don't have to wait thousands of years. Maybe we can carry that environment into this soil that we're looking to restore, and we can save the earth some time. So just a couple of thoughts, and really appreciating the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have a real clear picture of how that works, but it certainly is. It's really a novel approach that I hadn't heard before.
Well, apparently, you know, the organisms that naturally inhabit the soil are after food, and their food is starch. So the white rice and the stocking acts to capture it. The organisms go through the netting on the stocking,
Okay.
and they just devour the rice. And now you've got, you know, you put I don't know, I'm in the process of doing an experiment. I just dug one of them up a couple of days ago to take a look at it. And it looks like it's probably grown from what was maybe a half a pound of rice to maybe now 1.5 pounds, but it's obvious that it's filled with organisms.
Okay.
Planning to put that into a food supply, putting that into a bucket, literally a 5-gallon bucket of water with a bubbler in it to keep oxygen moving, and giving it some molasses and such, and then using that to restore some of the local organisms to this soil that, you know, was destroyed decades ago. So I'll let you know how the experiment goes. I'll keep Carrie posted.
So it would be similar to the slime mold, because the slime mold was after oats, which is also starch. But I'm wondering, how do you distribute those microorganisms into the new environment?
Well, what I'm planning to do is I'm planning to do both a watering, you know, like to pour it into the soil on top of inoculated seeds with mycorrhizal fungi on them, and then do a foliar spray from the water that, you know, I'm planning on letting it bubble for several days, which at least theoretically will multiply those organisms with molasses as a food supply, and then foliar spray it onto my garden, my plants, and just see how it will go with, you know, being inoculated with local soil organisms that have been here for thousands of years, you know, gone out into some of the rather undisturbed forest and bringing it back to our house lot, our property where we've got our gardens. So.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. And anyone who has done some hiking out west in what we would call barren desert, the national parks especially want to keep everybody on the trail because of these microscopic organisms that our eye can't see very well, but they are covering the poor soil out there. And if they can't get established, then the higher organisms of plants cannot root there. So it's very important to stay on the trail, except in areas where they've designated as off trail. Anybody else want to speak up about something that really drew your attention while you were reading the book? And Kim, I can't see if hands are up. So I don't know if you're keeping an eye on that.
I don't see any hands up, but there was, Dr. Rice already talked about a book that he put in the chat, and Marlene Holmes put another book suggestion in the chat for Finding the Mother Tree. Marlene, did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'll just say that it's very similar. It's by a scientist in Canada who grew up in a logging family that went back generations. And so she's mainly looking at the logging that was going on. And she actually worked first for a logging company and was then very upset when they just wiped everything out. And she started then going back and looking into it. And she's done over the years a number of long experiments. And one thing, I mean, it takes years to do experiments on trees. You realize that when you see she's going back to the ones that are now 30 years old. But it was much of I haven't read this book that you mentioned, but because I just finished this Finding the Mother Tree, I thought it was very similar. And she also gets into some of the Native Americans and their thoughts, as you mentioned, and their thoughts on the forest and their communication with the trees. But it's the idea that the tree and the mother tree will support the trees around it, depending on which ones they are, of course, but to a certain extent. And if you clear cut a forest area, that it is not as good as if you leave some of the other trees that you're not interested in, it will regrow much faster. So it was really looking at the logging industry to a certain extent.
If you if you look at an aspen stand, if you can find an aspen stand, go up into northern Wisconsin, and aspens are related to the cottonwoods. I think Ken referred to them. One aspen stand, and they may cover acres. It might be all one tree because they reproduce by suckering, so they send up shoots, and so the hundreds of trees that you might see might be all essentially one tree. And then you can start looking for the mother tree, which is typically bigger, but which is kind of interesting. So,
Mark, my husband planted an aspen tree in our yard. And I think it was either last summer or the summer before, when it was so dry. We did very little mowing, and he found sprouts coming up. And for every seedling that he saw, he kind of put I don't even know what to call it. It's some kind of a material that's fibrous, but firm. And it had a hole in the middle and it was circular. So he put that around each of the seedlings. So we have this bizarre looking moon kind of landscape in our yard. And I told him, look at they're coming off of the main roots from that tree. They're almost in a perfect circle around it. And we're talking 7 or 8 trees. I said, you can't leave it like that. I think they even extend over into the neighbor's yard. So far he's just blowing me off. He doesn't care. He wants to see what will happen. But it's exactly as you say, and it's just amazing.
yep, and they'll grow quickly, and they tend to be rather thin and kind of weak because they grow so quickly because they need a lot of light. But that's a good experiment. I'd leave it. So.
Again, I have to leave my hands off. I don't have any choice, or I won't be married. Kim, if you could show image number 3, that kind of works into what we're talking about in a certain way. So this is an example of Japanese gardening. We're all familiar with some of the other forms, but I had never seen this before. The whole idea dates back to the 14th century in Japan. And they produce lumber without cutting down the trees. So this sort of technique that they have is intended to yield more sustainable harvests, getting more wood out of the plants that actually are there. It says for the cedar trees, if that's what they're trying to grow, they get straight, unknotted construction wood. And I'm just wondering, Mark started touching on that. What would Peter Wolleben say about this? Would he recommend this kind of treatment? Would it be a good thing, a bad thing?
You get the neighbors talking.
Definitely. They're already talking about my yard. So we already know that it's a good possibility that some of the Southwestern Pueblo cultures overused the trees that were available to them. And how far can you drag these lodgepole pines and cedars? So perhaps if they had tapped into a technique like this, they might still have things for the ceilings of their pueblos. I don't know. It's kind of interesting to think about, though.
I do know that in Europe, all over Europe, coppicing was a technique that was used from the very early days, where with certain trees where they would cut them specifically so that they would do that. With coppicing, it happens farther down the tree, so that you don't get one big trunk, but the tree grows like a bush. And then they would cut, so sort of like what you do with red twig dogwoods. When you want to keep them nice and red, every year you remove a third of the stems because the older stems aren't red anymore.
Okay, Kim, I think we're done with that image. Thank you.
Of course, the author would say anytime you're inflicting a wound on the tree, you're inviting the fungi in, and that could diminish its lifespan. You know, it might be decades or hundreds of years before it died, but you're introducing potential fungus. Although cedars tend not to be, well, they tend to be resistant to decay and fungi, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Well, I feel like I'm hoarding the conversation here with my crazy yard, or maybe it's my crazy husband, I don't know. But he planted 2 ash trees. One of them fell to the fate with the ash tree borer, and the one that remained was badly wounded or weakened, and a storm actually started to crack the tree in half. And I said, whoops, that one's got to come down. And he said, well, I don't know, I'm going to play around with it. So using bolts and screws, he ran an extended piece of pipe from the part of the tree that was starting to come away from the main one. It looks hideous, but the tree is thriving. That part of it, which we thought we were going to lose, is just full of leaves and seeds. It's absolutely amazing.
Well, that reminds me of the story that the author talked about where the inside of the tree does become rotten, but the exterior where the bark is still has the ability to shoot water or sugar up the trunk to the leaves. So that must be the concept with that ash tree that your husband
I
was
imagine.
trying to save. So the leaves are still thriving and branches aren't falling off.
Nope.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mhm.
You'll have to
So
keep us
when you
posted.
look around at your yard, and you think about what you've read in the book, does that have any effect on the kind of gardening that you're planning to do? It's made me personally more hesitant to interfere because I'm not very smart. I don't know what all these different plants are going to need. And of course, my husband just goes into it blindly and says, well, I think I'll try this. But I just wondered how the book has affected you. And if you have a little bit of land, what it's making you think about.
Pam, I want to hold that thought. Everybody hold that question because Dr. Rice had his hand raised right as you started talking about that. So Dr. Rice.
I had put my hand down so that I wasn't interfering with the direction the conversation was going.
Okay.
In any event, a couple of thoughts that I was going to offer. I have a friend who's an arborist, and we have a piece of land in Missouri, and we had a tree that was hollowed out. Some damage was done. We see it was hollow inside, and he said, no, that's perfectly normal. That particular type of tree, and I don't remember what it was, this is many years ago, has a symbiotic relationship with a certain kind of ant, and the ants go into the tree and eat the center of the tree out, where there's a lot of weight, especially when the tree gets up higher. It eats the weight out, and the strength is in the circumference of the tree, and that's its survival mechanism to be able to grow and carry its own weight. That the core of it is actually eaten out by the ants, and that's how the tree survives. And then in terms of just looking at the whole picture of what we're maybe being presented with, I'm reminded of a quote from one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein. And he says, if you think you're separate or separated from the rest of humanity, you're living in an optical delusion. And what does our brain present to us? We think we're looking at something that's happening out there in the external world, when in fact what we're looking at is our brain's interpretation. And we don't actually see with our eyes, we see with our brains, and depending what we're structured with, that's the way we see the world. And I'd offer that perhaps your husband is, as opposed to going so blindly, maybe he's really tuned in and listening and being guided as to what this particular structure needs. And then when you think of Einstein talking about us living in this optical delusion, and you put that together with the stuff that came out of The Secret Life of Plants, where here's a plant that size the equivalent energetically, the pattern on the screen of this guy's lie detector size as though it's relieved. Oh, thank you for giving me this drink. And maybe all of these different apparent structures are really just expressions. Many of the ancient philosophies talked about one life, connectedness, and maybe all of these, what appear to be separate structures in our minds, are really just constructs that we've put into our minds in order to keep us out of the truth of what's going on. And maybe there's something with all of the intelligence, whether it's the slime mold or the human or the tree, maybe there's something back there that really is the source of all of that intelligence, and it's building different instruments to express its intelligence. My work is in part as a physician, and one of the things that I see is people who have certain thought patterns and certain attitudes, they end up with certain diseases. And I've come to believe or to understand that, cancer isn't some abnormal thing in a body. It's an expression of an energy that an individual is holding on to. And it's literally the structure trying to build another organ with which to express what this creative being called a human is engaging in. And it ends up being, the ABC disease or the XYZ disease. And when people resolve the energetic patterns, the things that are aberrant to our structures, when people resolve those patterns, those aberrant tissue structures tend to disappear. So maybe we're just experimenting with how we're going to build our own bodies and our own world, and maybe back behind all of it, as Einstein says, there's this optical delusion. We think we're really separate when in fact, the truth is there's really only one of us behind it all, whatever name you want to give it. And if we listen, we can attune to and advance the whole expression of the creation, or whatever you want to call it, and or we can retard it by ignoring that inner guidance. So just some thoughts to throw into the puzzle.
Well, Dr. Rice, I think we need to have a book discussion on the book that you're going to write, because it's going to be amazing.
I've already written it. It's called Why Is This Happening to Me Again? And it's how people tend to create patterns in their lives. And, you know, you take the geographic cure and go to the other side of the country, and the person that picks you up at the airport finishes the sentence that the person that dropped you off started. How do they know what to say to you? Because we're continuously communicating what it is that's we're expecting to happen. And when we realize that it's happening to me over and over and over and over again, and I want to blame somebody else for it, when I wake up, maybe I can change the pattern because I'm the one that was there every time it happened to me. So the book is out there.
Would you be able to add that title to the chat?
Oh, sure. I'll actually put a link in that anybody can download it free from my website.
How wonderful. Thank you very much. Wow.
Yeah, we just started a book study with a group in England. The bottom line is we have a tool we've developed over the last 50 years called forgiveness, which is how to access unconscious dynamics within ourselves and remove those patterns that interfere with the expression of our lives. And so there's a book study club in England that just started. I'll put a link in to the first session. We just did that the other night, where we walk somebody through this forgiveness tool, and a link to the book. So if anybody's interested, in 5 days a week, I do a radio show, and I'll put some information there too, that anybody's welcome to call and ask questions and participate in a discussion we've been having 5 days a week, an hour a day for the last 11 years on our radio show.
Well, I can't imagine that anyone would be not interested. What you're talking about would just bring so much hope to many, many people.
Yes, it's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Honored and delighted.
Thanks. I did see Jim had his hand raised.
You can be my doctor, Dr. Rice. I've been, we have a sanctuary up in Wisconsin, and the last 34 years I've been studying this, and I really have gotten such a strong sense of community. One of their lines was a tree is not a forest. And he's talking about the sense of community there. That's exactly the way I feel up there, but it's wonderful to hear somebody say it like it, maybe it's true. But there's a pine forest, and these trees, these pines are kind of close together. And of course, the DNR wants you to thin them all out and get rid of those, and because it was a plantation at one time. But these trees really like each other, and they are close together, and they're locked together up at the top. They're very tall, and they're locked together with their branches up. I went out like a fool. I was going to build a fence, and so I cut one of these with a chainsaw, and nothing happened. They didn't come down. They was going to stay there. They wrapped themselves around each other.
Holding on to each other.
Yeah, and, you know, you could use all kinds of words, but there's some affection there, and affinity. One of the words he used was an affection.
Yeah.
Anyway, so here we got the trees that are locked together at the top, and then as you drive down onto the land, there are these trees hanging that the root systems are exposed, and the trees are hanging there. But they've got, you know, I keep thinking they're going to come down. We're not going to be able to get through here. They don't come down, and they have got their roots all wrapped around each other as if to save each other. And they're either all going down together or no one's going down. And this is an intense sense of community that I kind of instinctively felt. But he's put some words on it, makes me feel less crazy.
Well, interesting to hear you talk about that. You know, one of the aspects of my work, I'm the director of a foundation, is translating a copy of the oldest known New Testament, its original Aramaic language, into English. And in the Aramaic language, that which is called the New Testament in thought in our Greek-oriented Western culture as a religious text, is not a text about theology. It's a text about physics, physiology, psychology, and genetics. And a particular phrase, and that's what I heard echoing as you spoke of that, from the Aramaic that was translated by the Greek as the kingdom of heaven, in Aramaic actually speaks of the community of love, the affection you're speaking of. And that community of love starts within us. And when we do that and we connect in that community, everything's transformed by strengthening that presence and that, you know, mutual support mechanism that you're talking about and recognizing. That's awesome.
I translate Aramaic into the sayings of Jesus, because I was done
Really?
with Jesus in the church a long time ago, but actually the Aramaic saved Jesus for me.
Well, if
It
you go
is
back to the Aramaic language, there's so much wisdom there. There's so much that, you know, I often kind of tongue in cheek in my workshops will say to people, if the man Yeshua, his name wasn't even Jesus, it was Yeshua, were to sit in most churches in the Western world, he'd say, that's all Greek to me. Because his Aramaic meanings, his actual words and meanings have been lost. And, you know, Vladimir Lenin says, and this is a guy who's probably responsible for more deaths on planet Earth than anybody in history. Vladimir Lenin says, if you want to destroy culture, just change the meaning of its words. We go back to those original words, there's some profound physics there and physiology.
But we'll have to have a conversation sometime about this. Probably not here, but the
I'll put my
idea is
contact
that
information in the chat.
yeah, there is a kind of matrix, and that's what he's talking about, kind of matrix that everything is connected to, whether it's under the surface, where all the root tendrils are, you know, getting connected and having conversations of some kind of chemical form, and then they're together up above, and then they're sending chemicals and things on scent and pollen all over. All this is going on, and we think they're all dead. We don't appreciate the way we communicate, and you know, we're having trouble getting along. You notice, and they seem to get along very well. They look out for the sick ones. I like that part of that book. They're really taking care of each other.
They don't have language. They don't use words to communicate, and words can be, you know, change the meaning of the words. That's where the human corruption starts to happen, when you start changing the meaning of the words. And if you go back to the idea of forgiveness in Aramaic, it's about removing the patterns that keep us separate. It's about removal. It's not about letting each other off the hook. But I'll put my contact information in, and I'd be delighted to have more conversation with what you're doing there.
Peter Welleben is a prolific writer. I looked up some of the titles of other things that he has written, and he's putting out at least one book a year, it seems. The one that we are talking about tonight was published in 2016. 2017, he published The Inner Life of Animals, and he also published Walks in the Wild. That's different from Walk in the Wild. Then 2018, The Weather Detective. 2019, Secret Network of Nature and The Secret Wisdom of Nature. Then in 2021, he wrote The Heartbeat of Trees. We'll just have to see what he comes up with for 2022. Has anyone read anything else by this author? Okay, is anybody planning to read anything else by this author?
Yeah, I
Oh.
think I'll check out his books. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had not looked up to see if he has written other books. So it's good to know.
Yeah,
They sound interesting.
yeah.
Steve raised his hand. Steve, you want to say something?
Yeah, I grew up, I'm in Northwest Illinois, and when I grew up, I used to walk through the forest. And of course, I learned everything about the forest from my parents and my grandparents and thought I knew a lot about them. But now, after reading these books and I walk out through the woods, I realize how little I know about the forest. And I look at it at a totally different perspective now. Everything is more social than I thought. Everything is brought together more than I thought. An example is we had a derecho here about a year and a half ago, and I have like 80 acres of, it was half timber, half prairie, and it flattened all the trees. And I was going to go in and cut them all out, and I didn't. I just left them. I just wanted to check to see what's going on. So I'm watching them right now. And it was interesting is this winter, the small mammals, the opossums, raccoons, skunks, all just multiplied like crazy. They're rabbits, squirrels, on all these fallen trees. And it was very interesting to watch. And so I'm finding myself watching more of nature than trying to read and apply what I've read. I just watch what nature is trying to tell me.
I think that's a great segue into, I think, I agree, Steve. I feel like this book made me more aware. I mean, I'm learning about nature all the time, but it makes me more interested in observing the trees, especially, and all of nature. And I do want to say, Steve, John Doerr has his hand up, Pam.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for the discussion. I only have read parts of the book right now, but in one of the chapters I read, he discussed Mancuso, Stefano Mancuso. I don't know if I just happened by chance to have read that book about 2 weeks ago, Revolutionary Genius of Plants. And in there, Mancuso is looking at bringing into question intelligence, and he's making the point that intelligence, when which we don't, if we judge it in human style, I mean, we're very narrowly discussing intelligence, but he talked about it in terms, and the author did too, to a point that plants are able to respond to their environment. And in the case of Mancuso, and I think he brought it up in this book too, is that, for example, the sensitive plant, you can only fool it about 3 or 4 times, and finally it'll just stop. But then if it gets, so you think you wore it out, but then again, if an insect came along and bit it, it would respond again. But the overall point of this is that we really approach life, we approach plants particularly from such a narrow point of view, and one that's so human-centric. And in reality, the plants generally, animals as too, can respond in just a wide range of things, and are basically intelligent in the plant world. And I think that's one of the most important concepts. And our author is thinking about that. Mancuso really brings it out quite clearly. And if you saw the program last week on PBS about slime molds, here's another full dimension where slime molds, which used to be thought of as plants, are their own world now, but they have a intelligence that's really beyond our comprehension as well. So all of these things have survived. And why did they survive? It's been more just than cause and effect. I'm starting to ramble around, but that was basically my thought.
I'm
Jim?
going to stop talking soon. I think the plants are watching us and wondering about our intelligence. I think they need to write a book that we could help to understand more about ourselves. They are our ancestors, absolutely, and they're inside us, and their sap and our blood is pretty much the same.
They're waiting for us to catch up.
Yeah, well, we're not catching up very well.
No,
Anyway, I really appreciate what the Natural Land Institute is doing and this discussions and all your ideas. I have to leave to save a marriage, so I'm going to have to go, but it's my own that I'm saving, not someone else's. Thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Jim. I wanted to kind of tag on to what Jim was saying about plants communicating. I think that, you know, Pam, you mentioned earlier about the author writing in personification style. And I think I think it was good because that's how we relate to things. And it helped me relate to what he was talking about. However, throughout the book, I did think about that every once in a while. I thought, now, why is he putting human emotions on what the trees are thinking or feeling, you know, human thoughts, human emotions? But honestly, it's like with kids, animated TV shows or movies, you're putting human characteristics onto animals and plants to create that story. So it's a way for us to relate to the story better. I mean, otherwise, how do you relate that information? That's the big question. I don't know how you could. So I'm glad that he used that style of writing, and it helped me understand some things better that he was talking about.
I think we have two hands up. Mark?
I was going to comment before Jim left us that if a tree were to write a book, what would they put it on? Paper? But to what Kim just said about the emotions and after reading this book, I actually participated in a prairie burn today, and it went through a woodland area and a bunch of big old bur oaks in this area that and some were getting singed a little. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder what they're feeling or what kind of messages that they're sending to the other oaks in the forest. And some of them, you know, were a little bit rotten and they caught fire on the inside a little bit. And we put some out and some we let go because they were basically dead trees, and it was hard to keep them going. But I was thinking about that, and it caused me to reflect, and maybe what we as humans need to do more is reflect on the big picture, on the whole forest. And I think that was kind of the gist of the book, about how everything is connected. And I think NLI does a good job as far as seeing that connectedness and trying to, you know, not just plant one type of plant in a prairie. Back in the old days of recreating prairie, it was a lot of big blue stem and Indian grass, and we've discovered it really wasn't like that. So, and one thing that really hooked me was page 1 in chapter 1, when he's talking about the mossy, what he thought were rocks, and he turned them over and they were actually part of this tree that was cut down, likely the mother tree of that area. You know, we've mentioned that before, that that one caught my eye, so I knew I'd be interested in the book. So I'm done.
John, did you want to say something?
no, I'm finished. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Your hand is still up.
Oh, okay. Now turn it off here.
Kim, could you put up the last image that I want to share for tonight?
Sure.
So here's a picture of some trees, some that are established, some that are off to a pretty darn good start. The mixed media artist by the name of David Bremeld captures the West Midlands of England, where my grandfather's ancestors are from. his mission is to record many of the dilapidated, abandoned factories and homes of that area near Birmingham. And he wants to do it with art, so he can preserve some history before it totally disappears. And he extends that tribute to nature too. He doesn't only focus on buildings. Lots of times he combines the two because the buildings are being overgrown by nature. But so what attracted me to him to begin with was this whole idea of the area that he's working in, because I do ancestry. And then I just thought, what an amazing thing to be a historian and an artist at the same time. And he's put out a book where he describes how he makes his paintings, using a lot of things that most artists wouldn't dare combine. So there again, the centricity of our thought, he takes it and he goes with it and he just makes beautiful, beautiful results. And I just selected this image because it puts me there. I'm walking right on the edge of the forest, you know, where it meets the prairie. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, well, I thought it was a beautiful image, so thank you for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
And I want to know what kind of tree that is. I mean, I think it looks like a bur oak tree, but it could be a different species if it was in England.
I'd say it's a good bet that it's an oak, but what kind, I don't know.
I do want to say that Dr. Rice put his contact information and the other links to his book club in the chat session. So be sure to check that out for anyone who's interested.
Anything else that anybody wanted to bring up related to the book? If you haven't started the book yet, I do think you're going to be shocked. Some other people that I talked with said when they started reading the book, especially the first chapter, they told themselves that the author had done everything within his power to grab our attention, and he was all out of material now. And that was just proven so false when people went ahead and continued reading the upcoming chapters in the book. I thought that was a really neat thing to say about the author's writing.
I agree with that comment. I kept wondering what else can he write about, and kept going. And that was a good point to make. So.
And he must have even more since he's published so many books.
Yeah.
I was actually introduced to this book a few years ago in a nature writing class that I took, and I only read 3 of the chapters that were part of this writing class that I took. But the whole idea of trees talking to each other through their roots or communicating has always fascinated me, and it has made me more aware of this idea in the last few years. But even after reading this book, the whole book now, I'm more conscious of the way that they communicate and feel, and even when they're breaking down, and the fungus that he talked, the whole fungi, all those organisms communicating with each other, it certainly heightened my awareness of how nature interacts with all the different organisms. We have about 5 minutes left, so any last thoughts or comments? Well, I want to say thank you to Pam for hosting this discussion and leading us with questions and thought-provoking ideas. And thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. I will be putting this recording up on YouTube either, and it'll be up by tomorrow at the latest. And if you want Dr. Rice's information, you weren't able to get it off the chat, then I can email it. I've been compiling his contact information and putting it in an email, and I can send it to you that way. You would have all received an email from me today for the Zoom link, so you can contact me that way, or I'll just put my email in the chat right now, so it's handy for you to see.
I wonder if you could just send out a group email. Do you have such a thing set up from everybody's registration?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, good idea.
It would be great. I thought that the participants were very enriching with all the different applications the book had kind of triggered for them, and all the different backgrounds that people are coming from, and we're finding how interrelated everything is.
Yeah. And just one more thing about the book, I really appreciated the citations that he had. So every time, not every time, but once in a while, when he would talk about something and there'd be a number there, I'd go to the back and look at the citation so I could, and I also highlighted some of them so I could go back and look up that information later. I really appreciated that part of the book. Although I did kind of feel like I was reading a term paper, or, you know, writing my senior paper in college so many years ago. But now I get why it's so important to do that. Oh, so many years later. Thank you, Mark, for helping us at the beginning with leading the meeting and welcoming everybody. And thank you, everybody, for your comments. Any other last questions or comments?
We didn't, and Paul came in late. Paul Bates is the president of the board for Natural Land Institute, and John Dewar, who spoke earlier, he's also a board member. And Judy, I think, was offline.
No, she's still on.
She's
Still
back.
here.
She's
Yeah.
back
Yep.
now, but when I introduced her, I think she was off. So Judy is one of our vice presidents of the board. So thank you very much, Pam. I enjoyed seeing the pictures too. That was a nice
Yes.
touch. So
Great preparation.
Yes.
I had a quick question.
Go ahead.
How does books like this change the way the Institute manage their properties?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we do have management plans that we create for each of our preserves.
Right, and what I'm seeing is most management plans are either focused toward maximizing lumber or basically maximizing lumber.
Oh,
And I'm saying is, how do you manage it to look at all the different things that a forest or a prairie or whatever needs in order to be healthy?
okay, that's a good question, and thank you for asking that. We don't cut lumber we don't cut trees for lumber, for one. If we do cut trees, it's to create more light on the understory, or it's to remove trees that are considered not native or invasive type of trees. And I'm not talking just about honeysuckle, shrubs like that. I'm talking about what are not trees that don't have high conservation value.
Right, but perfect example is we don't, at least when I look at it, is I don't know what has a high good conservation value. And in some of, I don't know if it's this book or one of the other ones, they were talking about some of these little trees may be 50 to 60 years old and they're only a foot tall because they don't have the light. And they need to be that in order to be healthy. They need that long to adjust to what's going on.
Yes, you're right.
And so this whole cutting the trees and doing different things and how we think nature should be is kind of scary, is that we really don't know what we're doing. And that my question is, books like this made me think about what should we be doing or what shouldn't we be doing, probably more than what we should be doing.
Fortunately,
So Steve, I'd like to kind of weigh in on that a little bit. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, saving the Belleville Prairie, an ancient 8,000-year-old ecosystem, is so important. because these kinds of sites in the ancient forests, they act as reference sites for us so that we can study them and we can know what they should look like. So that's what we use. We use reference sites for our restorations and our management to take a look at what is the kind of climax that we're leading to. Because you can have a management plan that maybe doesn't have that goal. For example, a forestry plan that works on board feet. But that's what we do, is we use these ancient sites as reference sites.
Right. I guess really what I'm trying to get to is that as humans, we all have biases. How do we get rid of that when we're trying to do like a tree bias or a forest bias? I'm looking at more of a forest than a tree, because an individual tree don't mean a whole lot. We really need a forest back. And that's really what I'm trying to wrap my head around. How do I get rid of my biases and just listen to what's going on there? It's very hard, at least for me it is. Maybe you guys, it's pretty easy, but for me, it's really difficult to do.
I don't know if this will answer your question, but I think that we do have staff, what we call stewardship staff, that have gone to school. They have degrees in ecology or natural resources. So they have studied, our director of stewardship, for example, is a tree expert. He just gave a tree workshop in January for us. And they have studied these things, and you're right, everybody has biases, but they are, as Carrie said, referencing other sites, referencing other preserves or other management styles and plans to create a management plan that works for us or works for protecting and preserving that property that we own. And we're constantly learning new things, and we're open. And I think our staff is constantly learning and evaluating, and they actually do monitoring of species. And that includes plant and animal species at not all of our preserves, because we own 25, but some of our preserves, so that they can see if the management plan is working for that site. And if they see something that's not right or doesn't seem right, they can go back and look at the management plan. And it could be related to forestry management or prairie management, because we have all kinds of habitats that we manage. So it's a constant, I think, evaluating of what we're doing and adjusting those
So Kim has just described the type of management plan that we use, which is called an adaptive management plan, where you do a technique and then you observe and you watch and you see what the response is. And if it's not the response that you want or that you think should be there, then you try something else. So all of our management is adaptive, and it has an aspect of watching, listening, and learning in it.
But the problem you have is tree life is like 2 or 3 times our human life. So that adaptive, the numbers don't match up, is what I'm trying to say. The lives don't match up. And that becomes a real problem.
We can't manage, Steve, we can't manage for an individual tree or anything like that. What we manage for is to create a healthy, resilient system. So we're working to assist those trees to do what they need to do by giving them the best ecosystem possible to do it in. Does that make sense?
Sort of. So what I'm thinking about is Menominee Forest up in Northwest Wisconsin. That one has been managed by some Indian tribe for a long time, and it works very well. So that's the type of thing you're doing?
Yeah, and they're managing it on a system-wide level.
Right.
So we don't manage for individual species, we manage for a system.
Right. Okay.
Pam, do you anticipate another book discussion in the near future?
We don't have any planned for the spring and summer. What we would do is evaluate if we want to do one in the fall. So we know people like to be outside more in the spring and summer. And our plan has been to have the book discussions in late fall and winter. So if we do any, we'll make an announcement on our Facebook page and our website and through email newsletters if we have any in the fall. So
Sounds
none at this time.
Suggestions definitely welcome, though,
Yes, they are.
truly.
I was just going to say that, so thank you, Paul.
We're always open to suggestions, book ideas. So email those book ideas to me.
Yeah.
And I'll send you that follow-up email with some of the chat comments in the.
Thank you.
Yeah, the other books that were mentioned as well.
And you said that the recording will be embedded in the Natural Land Institute's website.
We have a videos page. If you just go to our website, naturalland.org, and you scroll to the bottom, there's a quick links, and then there's the videos. You can click on that, takes you to the videos page. I can also email the link to you for YouTube, because we put it on YouTube and then we put it on our website. So it'll be available in both locations, but it takes a while to get it uploaded to YouTube. So it'll probably be tomorrow before I send it out to everybody.
Thank you. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. All right, any last thoughts or comments?
Selfishly, this is just a fun read.
Yes. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Superb.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you, Pam.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you,
problem.
Pam.
You're welcome.